Good morning, everyone, or good day, everyone. My name is Mark Kelso. I am the Social Studies Department coach here for Ball High School in Galveston, Texas. And I want to thank the Friends of the National World War II Memorial for inviting me back this year as a presenter. This year's theme was Coming Home. And for a great amount of years, I've been working on several projects to bring some MIAs home. Not all of our men have come home, but our government is still working 75 years later to bring some of them home to their family. And this particular case really grabbed me. It was an MIA who was part of the ordeal that my grandfather was in, and I ran across this story totally by accident, but I think it's worth being told, and that's what I'm going to do here today. I'm going to talk to you today about a young man named Lieutenant Hyman Victor Sherman. And Lieutenant Sherman's story is very interesting. His end was very tragic, but the redemption part is what's going on now, and hopefully we can bring Lieutenant Sherman home. Well, he was born Hyman Victor Susi in Smyrna, Turkey, and if any of you do realize what this part of the region was, is in 1913 there was a region of Asia Minor, which is now part of Turkey, that had a pretty significant Greek population. And prior to the end of World War I, this Greek population was very prominent in Smyrna. Well, they were also part of the Ottoman Empire. And once the Ottoman Empire fell after World War I, this area of Asia Minor was one of those areas where the Treaty of Versailles negotiators were arguing over. The Turks wanted it for the Turkish side, and the Greeks wanted it for the Greek side. Well, in order to compromise that, the Treaty of Versailles negotiators created what they called a Zone of Smyrna, which was partitioned from the old Ottoman Empire, and it was designed to protect the Greek population in the city of Smyrna. Well, this Greek population was a large part of the economic output for the region. Well, in order to protect these populations, the Greek army actually landed in the Anatolia region of Asia Minor following World War I in order to protect this Greek population as per the Treaty of Versailles negotiators. Well, the Turks didn't like this very much. In fact, the Turkish nationalist movement was really taking over Turkey at the time with the power vacuum of the Ottoman Empire. And they didn't like the Greeks in this region because, again, it was a Turkish nationalist movement that wanted this part of Asia Minor for Turkey. So it sparked another conflict between Greece and Turkey between 1919 and 1922 called the Greco-Turkish War. And this family was in the middle of it. Well, interesting how we got to this point. I was, researching, my own grandfather because he was, part of this ordeal, and I kept running across Lieutenant Sherman's names in war crimes trial depositions, and I kept trying to look him up, trying to find his past, and I kept hitting roadblocks. And finally, a break in the case came about 3 years ago. My son wanted to invite one of his friends over for supper. And I said, sure, bring the whole family over. Well, this family's name was Sherman. And they were a Jewish family from Georgia. And I just threw a Hail Mary. I said, look, I'm doing research on a young second lieutenant who was a Greek Jewish kid from Smyrna, Turkey. And I'm hitting a roadblock. And I didn't know if you all were any relation to him or not. Well, about 3 weeks later, this child's mother got back to me and told me what I needed to know. He was not always named Hyman Victor Sherman. He actually came to the United States under another name and adopted this name later on, and which we'll get into. Well, their original family name was Susi, Soussi. This is where the case made its break, is instead of looking through the documentation I had regarding Hyman Victor Sherman, I started looking up Hyman Victor Susi, and of course, the information is there. Well, things are not going well for the Greek armies in Asia Minor to the point where several major battles are being lost, and it does not look like the Greeks are going to keep this part of Asia Minor. So the Susi family decides to leave their home from Smyrna in 1921. Young Hyman is 9 years old, and they take the whole family. The census records indicate his grandmother Sarah goes, his father Samuel, his mother Anna, both his sisters Suzanne and Sarah, and again Hyman, who's the baby. Well, the family arrives in Marseille, France in late June of 1921 and continues from Marseille to the United States, where they arrive in Providence, Rhode Island in July of 1921. Well, the Soucy family decides to settle in the Bronx of New York City because there is, again, a large immigrant Jewish population in this part of the city, and this is where they chose to live. Their address in the census records for 1930 is listed as 1951 Southern Boulevard, which is right in the middle of the Bronx. And Hyman's father is listed as a peddler. Well, this is where it really gets interesting. Is the family, again, is part of a very small minority Jewish Greek population. They had established earlier in the century. They had established a synagogue in Manhattan, which is still there, and the family does attend this synagogue called the Kedosha Janina, which is located in Manhattan. And again, it is still there, and I did contact them. He also enrolls in American schools. He is a high school student at DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx, and he participates in JROTC. He's part of the handball club, and he's also an actor. And he graduates in 1930 and is accepted to the City College of New York. Well, during this time period, the family does suffer some loss. His grandmother dies in 1929. His father dies in 1931, and this is where I was able to trace down the activities of the family, because his father was buried under the Brotherhood of Janina's cemetery in Queens. So this is where we trace the synagogue for the family. Well, young Hyman is now the man of the house, and he decides his second year of college in 1932 to petition for naturalization, and naturalization is granted in November of 1936, and this is where Hyman changes his name from Hyman Victor Soucy to Hyman Victor Sherman. We don't know why he changes his name at this time. In fact, I contacted the family and asked them what the story behind that was, and they don't know. And again, his occupation is listed as a stenographer. Here's the front page of his declaration. And here's page 2 and 3, where his citizenship in the United States of America is granted on November of 1936. Well, between 1936 and 1940, there's a pretty much gap in his life. I really can't figure out what was going on with him up until 1940. He joins the military sometime between 1936 and 1940, and the next reading I have of him is a dental chart taken at Fort Ord, California in 1940. Lieutenant Sherman's military records were unfortunately lost in the NPRC fire of 1973, so getting his 201 file is not going to happen, but I was able to obtain his individual deceased personnel file, which has some information that we can probably track him down, and this is where I got the dental chart. His initial dental records were taken at Fort Ord in 1940. Well, the rest of the family decides to relocate to California with him. The next reading we have of the Soucy family is that they relocate to Los Angeles. Again, young Hyman is stationed at Fort Ord, and his family decides to go to California with him. Well, his sisters, Suzanne and Sarah, petition for naturalization as well while they're in California. Well, they also changed their full name. Suzanne Soucy changes her name to Estelle Sherman, which is Hyman's aunt, and his other aunt, Sarah, changes her name to Shirley. And they again adopt the surname of Sherman. Well, sometime after 1940, Lieutenant Sherman is part of the 53rd Infantry Regiment and is assigned as a second lieutenant to the Philippine Army and stationed in the Philippines, particularly Fort McKinley. Well, as we know from our history books, the Japanese attacked the Philippine Islands on December 8th, the same day as Pearl Harbor. The air attacks start. They land 43,000 troops 3 days before Christmas, 1941. Douglas MacArthur activates War Plan Orange, WPO-3. Manila is declared an open city the day after Christmas. Lieutenant Sherman retreats to the Bataan Peninsula with his unit and surrenders on April 9th, 1942. Lieutenant Sherman then takes part in the infamous Bataan Death March. And for those of you that are not familiar with it, it was a forced march from various places on the Bataan Peninsula to the railhead station at San Fernando, Pampanga. From there, the prisoners are taken from the railhead at San Fernando to a town called Capas Tarlac, and then to Camp O'Donnell. On the death march, an estimated 800 Americans lose their life on the march, and an estimated 18,000 Filipinos die on that 70-mile forced march. Well, Sherman arrives at Camp O'Donnell with about 9,000 other Americans from the Bataan campaign. And according to the best source on Camp O'Donnell, which is Colonel John Olson's book, Andersonville of the Pacific, a little over 1,500 Americans die at Camp O'Donnell from disease and malnutrition. The troops are quartered in bamboo huts known as nipa huts. They're put on supposedly a 1,500-calorie rice ration a day. It's a starvation ration. The average death rate's between 30 and 50 men. It's not a pleasant place. And due to this high death rate at Camp O'Donnell, the Japanese decide to close the camp, and move the prisoners to a series of camps outside of the town of Cabanatuan. Cabanatuan ends up being pretty much the largest camp in the Philippines. The prison camps were located about 10 miles from the actual town of Cabanatuan, and Lieutenant Sherman arrives there sometime around July of 1942. Again, the death rate is still ranging from 30 to 50 prisoners of war per day. The Corregidor prisoners, the ones who have surrendered in May and were held on Corregidor through June, are now joining these prisoners at Cabanatuan. Again, one thing I want to clear up here is that a lot of people lump Bataan and Corregidor into one thing. The Bataan Death March took place from April 9th through about April 17th. Well, Corregidor did not surrender to May 8th. So the Corregidor veterans were not part of the Bataan Death March. But again, because of what's going on with lack of medicines, lack of proper food, lack of proper quarters, again, 30 to 50 prisoners are still dying per day, even at Cabanatuan, from diseases such as dysentery, beriberi, and other treatable diseases. Well, Lieutenant Sherman remains at Cabanatuan for nearly 2 years, until October of 1944. Well, with the Battle of the Philippine Sea that takes place in June of 1944, the American Navy now pretty much has open reign of the Western Pacific. This particular battle ended any kind of Japanese sea power threat in this part of the world, resulting in American forces initiating blockade tactics around the Philippine Islands. To the point where September 21st, 1944, about a month before the Leyte invasion, American aircraft start to make themselves known over the island Luzon, and in particular, Grumman F-6F Hellcats start to appear over Cabanatuan. And the prisoners at Cabanatuan are elated. They think it's almost over. Well, unfortunately, not for them. Well, due to this imminent invasion, Japanese leadership decides to implement a crash program to get these prisoners to Japan. And in order to do that, they try to draft as many prisoners as they can out of Cabanatuan to be loaded upon ships to take to the home islands. These ships are known by the prisoners as hell ships. The population of Cabanatuan in September of 1944 is around 4,000 prisoners. And the first draft of 1,800 prisoners leaves Cabanatuan around October 1st, 1944, and is sent to Bilibid Prison in Manila. Well, they leave Manila on October 21st on a Japanese cargo ship known as the Air San Maru. And the Air San Maru, unfortunately, was sunk by an American submarine 3 days out of Manila, and there were only 8 survivors out of 1,800. Lieutenant Sherman is not aboard the Air San Maru, but I wanted to tell you about the Air San Maru because this is kind of a prelude of what's to come. Well, Lieutenant Sherman leaves on the second largest draft from Cabanatuan sometime around October 13th through 17th, 1944. And this draft is about 1,600 prisoners, but due to constant air attacks, the Japanese can't get ships into Manila until about the first part of December when a typhoon comes through. And due to this severe weather, pretty much air activity stops over Manila, and the Japanese were able to get some ships in. Well, the ship we're going to focus on for this presentation is the Japanese passenger liner Orioka Maru. She was built in 1937 and was pretty much the Titanic for the pre-war Japanese passenger liner service between Kobe and Dairen. It's a beautiful ship, but again, she's been converted into an armed troop ship for the war. Well, Japanese commanders at Bilibid order Navy pharmacist mate Robert Kintner to prepare a roster of all POWs that are fit to travel that are still at Bilibid prison. And the Japanese doctor, Captain Naranji Noji, orders medical exams for the prisoners on December 12th, 1944. And once the medical exams are completed, Kintner prepares a roster, and the prisoners on the roster are informed that they will be departing the next morning for Japan. And of course, word has gotten around to the prisoners that this is pretty much a death sentence. There's going to be trouble. Well, on the morning of December 13th, Japanese authorities marched 1,621 Allied prisoners out of Bilibid prison to Pier 7 in Manila. And these rosters, again, are by rank and in columns of 4. And there is a Bilibid transfer roster, which helps to determine where the position on the vessel was for specific prisoners of war. And they're marched by columns of 4 through the streets of Manila, hoping that American intelligence will see them and not report it, and so the ship won't get attacked. And of course, the prisoners make it to Pier 7. Well, the Japanese in charge of this move are Lieutenant Junzaburo Toshino and interpreter Shisuke Wada. These two men are known to the prisoners of war. Toshino was the adjutant at Cabanatuan. He worked very closely with American officers there to make sure things worked well for the Japanese. And then Shisuke Wada was the English interpreter for the POWs at the second largest camp in the Philippines, known as Davao Penal Colony down in Mindanao. They're widely known to the prisoners. Toshino does not have a very good reputation, and neither does Wada. Well, these 1,621 men arrive at Pier 7, and of course Manila Harbor is showing evidence of prior attacks. It doesn't look good. On the starboard side of the pier, the Orioka Maru is berthed, and here's a picture of the Orioka Maru prior to World War II when she was brand new. Well, she starts to load her cargo, and also on board there's about 3,500 Japanese civilians, several women and children who are the families of high-ranking Japanese officials. This is going to be the last ship out of the Philippines prior to the U.S. invasion or the U.S. retaking the Philippines, so the Japanese are trying to get as many people out as they can. The Japanese passengers board the ship first, and then later in the afternoon the Japanese start to load their prisoners. Well, the prisoners don't have the luxury of being in the cabins. They're put down in the cargo holds. And conditions are not really good in the cargo holds. They occupy the first hold, the second hold, and of course the rear number 4 hold. And the ship departs Manila late in the afternoon with a sub-chaser and a Japanese destroyer called the Momo. The conditions are just really not good in the holds. Things start to deteriorate almost immediately. Temperatures down in the holds are reaching 150 degrees. The excessive heat is causing the men to panic. The first casualty is Lieutenant Colonel Francis Conity, who is in the rear hold, suffers a major asthma attack and dies within an hour of boarding the ship. Prisoners are suffocating. And due to the position on the Bilibid transfer roster, Lieutenant Sherman is in the rear hold. He is one of the last people to board the ship in the rear hold. And the rear hold, which is the number 4 hold, is the smallest hold, yet it is the most crowded with about 750 prisoners. And here is a general arrangement drawing of the Orioka Maru that was achieved from the War Crimes Trial Record Group 331 at the archives, denoting where the prisoners are located on the ship. And again, the rear hold is the smallest hold, but yet it's holding the most prisoners. So the loading plan was kind of not thought out very, very well. And the Orioka Maru lifts anchor and again, bunkers off of Corregidor. What I mean by bunkers, she takes on coal. She fills her coal bunkers for the trip. Her next stop will be Kaohsiung, Taiwan, which was then to Cal Formosa. During that night, estimated 35 prisoners die in the rear hold due to suffocation. The ship's not moving. She's anchored, and she's taking on coal. Well, she completes her bunker operations about 4 o'clock in the morning the next morning, and gets underway and parallels the coast of Bataan. And again, here's the first picture where the Orioka Maru is spotted making a run up the west coast of Bataan by aircraft from the USS Hornet CV-12. Well, the ships or the aircraft from the Hornet attack the Orioka Maru. She is a target. She is unmarked as carrying prisoners. Nice target for aircraft. aircraft from the Hornet and later from the USS Cabot commence attacks on the Orioka Maru, to the point where the captain, Captain Shin Kajiyama, decides to beach the ship at the mouth of Subic Bay at West Point to keep the ship from sinking, in case the bomber scored direct hit. Here is some film footage of the Orioka Maru that was recently discovered of that first attack. It lasts for about a minute. Again, this footage was discovered and sent to me not too long ago. But it's the footage of the Orioka Maru off the coast of Bataan under attack by aircraft from the USS Hornet. But you got to understand there's 1,621 prisoners of war and about 3,500 Japanese civilians on board the ship. But again, the Japanese did not mark it with a green cross as per the Geneva Convention. So she was a nice target for the Grumman F-6 Hellcats from the USS Hornet and the USS Cabot. Well, here's the Orioka Maru again, anchored off of West Point, and conditions in the holds continue to be just deplorable. The prisoners start to go insane from thirst, and murders take place, fights take place. Prisoners stealing water from the other. Some of them resort to drinking urine. It's just not a very good picture in the holds of the Orioka Maru. But during these attacks, the Japanese force American doctors out of the holds to come treat the Japanese casualties. Anti-aircraft gunners from the Orioka Maru actually down one of the F-6Fs, piloted by Lieutenant John Thompson from the USS Cabot. He is still MIA. And during the night, the Japanese decide to move the Orioka Maru from West Point into the inner harbor of Subic Bay off the coast of the old Subic Bay Navy base. Well, about 7:30 in the morning, fighter planes from the USS Hornet return, and as the Japanese order the American prisoners out of the holds, these planes attack. This time, the Hornet's planes score a direct hit on the Orioka Maru, killing about 270 American prisoners of war and wounding several others. According to the diary of Lieutenant Colonel Carl Englehart, who was in the rear hold, Lieutenant Hyman Sherman is wounded in this attack pretty bad. And during this attack, also, panic-stricken guards decide they're going to fire their rifles in the hold. In fact, one of them actually throws a grenade in the hold. And Lieutenant Toshino, the guard commander, kills another American lieutenant who he catches in a galley looking for food. And again, the Japanese order the remaining prisoners ashore. And if several prisoners attempt to escape, there's a machine gun set up on the beach by Japanese Marines, and several prisoners are killed that way. 3 men do successfully escape, though. Well, the prisoners swim from the Orioka Maru, and if you look at this picture of the ship, between the ship and the shoreline, you can see the prisoners swimming ashore. And they're corralled into a tennis court at the Subic Bay Navy base. Lieutenant Sherman is helped ashore. He is carried ashore because he's severely wounded. We don't know by whom, but he makes it ashore and is held with the remaining 1,350 prisoners in a tennis court, which is part of the old Subic Bay Navy base at Olongapo. They remain at the tennis court for 5 days. Again, Lieutenant Sherman is severely wounded. They remain at this tennis court for 5 days. There's no medical treatment whatsoever. Doctors are having to perform amputations from prisoners who are wounded without anesthesia and mess kit knives. It's not a pretty picture here on the tennis court. And they stay there from the 15th through the 20th of December. On the 20th, the Japanese decide they're going to go ahead and move these prisoners of war from the tennis court at Olongapo at the Subic Bay Navy base to San Fernando, Pampanga. They still want to get them to Japan. So they need to get them to a place where they can get them on a railhead to reach the ships at the Lingayen Gulf. So they take them to the railhead at San Fernando, Pampanga, where they're quartered in the Pampanga Provisional Jail, which you see at the top here, and the Pampanga Theater, which is at the bottom. Lieutenant Sherman is in the Provincial Jail. Here's an aerial photograph, post-war aerial photograph of San Fernando, Pampanga, which denote all the areas that we are talking about here. Here's the rail station, the Pampanga Theater, the Provincial Jail, and the cemetery, which is known as the Campo Santo de San Fernando, which is going to be a prominent feature in what happens to Lieutenant Sherman. Here's pretty much a map of where they've gone so far. Several men die in the theater in the jail, including Corporal Eugene Specht, who was the man who had his arm amputated on the tennis court. He passes away in the Pampanga theater. Well, in order to relieve Lieutenant Toshino, Lieutenant General Shiyu Kuo, the commander of all Filipino prisoner of war camps, sends his adjutant, Lieutenant Keizo Urabe, with a complement of soldiers to San Fernando, Pampanga to attempt to alleviate the situation. And he also has orders for Toshino. And Urabe brought with him a man named Master Sergeant Tsukitoshi Tanawi. I'm introducing him now because he's going to figure prominent in what goes on with Lieutenant Sherman pretty soon. Well, Urabe orders Toshino to pick 15 sick and wounded prisoners that are unable to travel. Well, Toshino instructs interpreter Wada to approach the American doctors in the theater and the provincial jail to pick 15 sick and wounded prisoners for shipment back to Manila. Well, Dr. Kerry Miller-Smith and Dr. Jack Schwartz and Lieutenant Colonel Carl Englehart picked these men to theoretically go back and receive treatment at the prisoner of war hospital in Manila. Carl Englehart picks Lieutenant Sherman as one of these severely wounded prisoners to go back to Manila. Well, after the selection of the prisoners, the Japanese placed them aboard a truck and moved them out of the town of San Fernando to the cemetery known as the Campo Santo de San Fernando. And to the right here is a picture of that cemetery. One by one, interpreter Shisuke Wada leads the condemned men to a pit that's been previously dug, and Toshino orders Master Sergeant Tanawi to behead these prisoners. Tanawi, of course, protests, and Toshino repeats his order. He's not gonna let him out of this duty. Tanawi decapitates 7 of these prisoners before he throws his sword down and asks to be relieved. Corporal Kazutuni Aihara, which you can see his picture at the top right, and Private Jiro Ueda murder the rest of the prisoners. The grave is covered up, and the Japanese return to San Fernando. Lieutenant Hyman Victor Sherman is one of these prisoners who is executed. The next day, the remaining prisoners are put on rail cars and sent to San Fernando La Union, which is on the Lingayen Gulf, for continued shipment to Japan. They board 2 vessels, the Honora Maru and the Brazil Maru. And their destination is to Cal Formosa, which is present-day Kaohsiung, Taiwan. They arrive there to Cal Formosa New Year's Day, 1945. The Japanese decide to move the 235 prisoners from the Brazil Maru and consolidate them aboard the Honora Maru on January 6th. Well, as fate may have it, on January 9th, again, the fighters from the USS Hornet receive orders to attack shipping into Cal Formosa Harbor, and they spot the Honora Maru along with the Kuroshio Maru in a ship's nest in the lower part of the harbor, and they commence to attack both of them. Here's where the prisoners were located on the Honora Maru. Well, unfortunately, the American bombers hit the Honora Maru and kill about 411 prisoners of war. Well, these prisoners of war are these bodies are moved ashore and buried. The remaining prisoners, the remaining 930 that are still alive, are put back aboard the Brazil Maru and taken to Japan. Well, the Brazil Maru arrives in Moji, Japan on January 28th. She takes her pilot the next morning on the 29th, and they arrive at Moji Harbor, or the Moji port, early that morning. There's 581 bodies aboard the ship, but only 547 are alive. About 30 men died during the transit through the Kamunzo Channel. Here's a picture of the Brazil Maru, the general arrangement drawing. And then below is a sketch that was done by one of the prisoners aboard the Brazil Maru, Dr. Eugene Jacobs, who actually survived the ordeal. This is what it was like to be aboard the Brazil Maru. The men disembark from the Brazil Maru and are taken here to this receiving building, this quarantine receiving building in Japan, and divided into 5 groups. So the first group is what they call the hospital group. 110 men are sent there, 76 die. This is where my grandfather died. The next group is sent to Camp Fukuoka number 1. 55 of them die. The third group to Fukuoka number 3, 24 prisoners die there. The next group is sent to camp number 4, which is there in the Moji Harbor. 37 die, and then finally the last group of mostly enlisted men goes to Fukuoka 17, but only 10 die there. By April of 1945, they recovered enough to where the Japanese decided to get them out of Japan proper and move them over to Korea and Manchuria, where they are liberated in September of 1945. Here are the numbers. Again, you can go over this on your own. Here are the numbers. 1,621 men left Manila in December of 44. 403 survived the war. Well, the Judge Advocate General opens up a investigation into the Orinoco Maru based on the early debriefs from Colonel Jack Schwartz and Commander Kerry Smith. And the International Military Tribunal for the Far East opens up a case against Lieutenant Toshino and his men. This actually takes it a step further. Chicago Tribune journalist George Weller starts to interview prisoners of war after the liberation and publishes an 8-day expose on the Orinoco Maru. And the investigation leads to, the discovery information leads to back to the Campo Santo de San Fernando Cemetery, where the remains of 19 Americans are recovered, including Lieutenant Sherman. This discovery information proves that Lieutenant Sherman was one of the men taken out of the provincial jail. Lieutenant Colonel Carl Engelhart and Major Calvin Choon also denote that Lieutenant Sherman was taken out of the provincial jail the evening of the 23rd. X-425 from the Manila Mausoleum is preliminarily ID'd as Lieutenant Sherman, but later on the Board of Inquiry overturns that ID. In September of 1947, the graves registration people tag Lieutenant Sherman's remains as unrecoverable because, again, he is initially thought lost on the Orinoco Maru, but because of the discovery information from the Toshino trial, which closes in 1948, his case is reopened. Well, X-425 is renamed X-891 and is sent to the Manila Mausoleum for possible ID by the forensic expert Mildred Trotter. Unfortunately, Trotter's people are not able to ID Lieutenant Sherman's remains based on his dental records. Those remains are reverted back to 425 and are buried to this day in the Manila American Cemetery as an unknown. All right, he is still listed as MIA. Captain Junzaburo Toshino, the guard commander, was sentenced to hang. He was sentenced to death on May 9, 1947, and his execution was carried out in August of 1948. Interpreter Shisuke Wada, again, he was on trial with Toshino, was given a life sentence. Unfortunately, with Japan regaining its sovereignty, he was released from Sugamo prison in the mid-1950s. This guy, Corporal Kazutuni Aihara, who was known as Air Raid by the POWs at Cabanatuan, was convicted of firing his rifle and throwing grenades into the hold of the Orinoco Maru, and he murdered at least 3 of the helpless prisoners at the San Fernando Cemetery. Because of his actions, he was also sentenced to death with Toshino and hanged on the same day. Master Sergeant Tanaui, who reluctantly beheaded 7 of the prisoners at the San Fernando Cemetery, was given a 25-year sentence at hard labor, but again, with his sovereignty returning to Japan, was released in the mid-1950s. Well, in the last 10 years, the United States government has reopened several POW MIA cases. 2015, due to some reforms, we now have the Defense POW MIA Accountability Agency, and they have taken an interest in the events of the Orinoco Maru. In 2015, some of my friends who are descendants from the Orinoco Maru started getting calls from forensic genealogists who were looking for DNA donors, and particularly with the Onora Maru. And in November of 2020, DPAA announced the Onora Maru project, which their primary focus is to ID the remains of the men that were killed on the January 9th Onora Maru attack. These remains, again, were taken out of China after the war and put in Section Q of the National Cemetery in Hawaii at the Punch Bowl. DPAA is also going to exhume unknown graves in Manila associated with the San Fernando Cemetery, including those possibly of Lieutenant Hyman Sherman. So there may be a chance that Lieutenant Sherman will come home. Some notable people aboard the Orioke Maru. General Harold K. Johnson was the Chief of Staff of the Army from 1964 to 1968. Lieutenant William Cummings, who was a Catholic chaplain, quoted to Time magazine on the Bataan that there are no atheists in foxholes. He died aboard the Brazil Maru en route to Japan on January 26, 1945, and was buried at sea. And Major Thomas Smothers, who was the father of the famous comic duo the Smothers Brothers. There are two men still alive from the Orioke Maru. The first one is Colonel Ben Scarden. He's 103 years old and is still with it. And the next is Brigadier General Paul Phillips, also 103 years old and doing remarkably well. Here are my sources for this presentation, and my special thanks to these people who are on the list here. Several of them are Orioke Maru survivors. I will open up the floor to questions now if anybody has any. Thank you very much for your attention.